Hey there everybody. Before this video begins, I just want to put out a quick content warning for this video. Final Fantasy X talks a lot about heavy subject matter, but most especially desperation and death. While I don't explore the concept of death and dying in detail, it is a central theme for the game and a talking point that I'll get into later. If you are sensitive to the subject and would like to avoid that conversation, there will be timestamps in the description that you can use to skip over the big part where I talk about it exclusively. Also, if you are in crisis or are contemplating something drastic, please reach out to somebody. The US Crisis Lifeline can be reached by just dialing 988 on your phone. You can also text HOME to 741-741 if you prefer to message somebody instead of calling a person. You matter. Take care of yourselves. That being said, let's move on to the main event. This video contains heavy spoilers for Final Fantasy X. The year is 2014. Our little galactic blue ball is 2 years past the Mayan predicted doomsday. The United States is 2 years away from what would go on to be one of the most prolific elections in recent national history. Another 4 years after that, a deadly pandemic would strike, with the after effects still rocking the world over. But that's not to say that the world wasn't going through it in 2014 as well, not by a long shot. We had a strain of Ebola break out in West Africa. A Boeing 777 airliner disappeared somewhere over the Gulf of Thailand, with its 239 passengers vanishing with it. The World Health Organization identified a sudden spread of polio in at least 10 different countries around the world. A little Sunni militant group calling themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, aka ISIL or ISIS, started their offensive in the Middle East. Another Boeing 777 was shot down in Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile, killing all of its 298 people aboard. Protesters, led by Benny Tai Yun-ting, occupied government offices in Hong Kong, China. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change finished and released its fifth assessment report, declaring that, quote, the world faces severe, pervasive, and irreversible damage from global CO2 emissions. And in America, President Barack Obama announced the military's campaign of unmanned drone airstrike assaults against ISIS forces in Iraq and Syria. 2014 was also the year that Joan Rivers, Ann B. Davis, Run Run Shaw, Shirley Temple, and Robin Williams all passed away. Rest in peace. It always strikes me as odd when people say how terrible of a year it's been. Like, the events of this year are so atrocious compared to the last, or the year before that, or 5 or 10, 15 years ago. Personally, I think comparing tragedies is almost pointless, because to someone, somewhere, directly or indirectly, somebody is having the worst day of their life, and in that moment, they're going through something they believe is more impactful than anything happening to anyone somewhere else. Somebody involved in the Columbine massacre will have something to say to the person that was involved at the Sandy Hook shooting. Some of us who went through the COVID-19 pandemic could have a lot to say to those who were alive during the polio outbreaks in the 1950s. In the year 2014, my own grandmother, who'd lived with me and my family for nearly 5 years by this point, got devastatingly sick very quickly and passed away unexpectedly after being carried out of our house on a stretcher in front of me and my siblings. We found out later that she'd become septic, a poison spread in her own body, after an operation she'd had earlier that month. She was ill, and there wasn't anything we could have done to help her. Her own mother, my maternal great-grandmother, had also just passed away that previous summer. In the year 2014, my father, whom I've idolized as this man who could do anything, had a solution for everything, who's been indomitable his entire life, found out that he had cancer. Suddenly, our entire lives ground to a halt as he had to stop working, stop thinking more than a few months ahead about what we were going to do for summer vacation and birthdays and everything else. All we could think about was getting him to the hospital on time for chemotherapy and his other treatments. I had to sit back and watch my indomitable father get bullied by a disease that's already claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of other people's fathers, their sisters, their mothers, or their brothers. I wasn't allowed to focus on my own life goals anymore, as there was a growing void in my own home. Personally, I think comparing tragedies is pointless. From another point of view, it can shirk somebody else's trauma and what it took to overcome or just fight off those feelings. But in the year of 2014, nobody suffered more than I did. Nobody suffered more than I did. But that's the thing about suffering, right? You're a better person on the other side of it. Or at least you've become stronger than the suffering, whether you believe it or not. Coping mechanisms take all sorts of shapes and sizes. It can be the smallest, most minute difference in your life. But to somebody in suffering, it's the most important thing in the world to find a method of turning around tragedy. Sports, toys, collections, movies, trading cards, board games, photography, drawing, your family, friends, drinks, drugs, crafts, cars, cooking, fishing, swimming, television, music, or video games. It was my dad who encouraged me to pursue video games as a hobby. From our very first Super Nintendo cartridge to our very ill-kept collection of PlayStation 1 games, I was thrown into fantasy landscapes and rich worlds under his guidance, and I could never begin to find a way to thank him enough for that. My mom mostly saw it as an expensive way to dodge doing homework after school, though she did eventually admit to liking the Crash Bandicoot games quite a bit. Anyway, this hobby of mine would eventually turn into a lifelong tradition of picking up new games, playing them with my brother beside me, and now getting to make internet content for me to share with the world. And when times got tough, the whirring of a disc spinning inside this little gray square, not even a foot long, was there to greet me like an old friend from days past. Something like an alternate dimension where nothing and no one had changed a bit. The screen would light up and I'd be taken to a digital world where I was the hero, where I could set things right, where even if there was some kind of huge, complicated problem, I could always find a way to get through it and make everybody happy again. World after world, it was me who saved people, who made them smile, who brought them peace. Video games are such a magical experience. Sometimes that's literal. There's every kind of genre out there for every kind of person. To live out their wildest dream or sit through a peaceful escape. When my world spun out of control in 2014 and nothing was ever going to be right again, and the fear of the unknown crept in on a teenager who wasn't even confident he was going to graduate high school, video games were the only thing to bring still that anxious, apocalyptic sensation that I woke up with every day. I would slip away into crumbling jungle ruins, through childhood cartoons come to life, stopping weapons of mass destruction, and onto vast, far-reaching oceans of a million different shades of blue, carried off into exotic, fantastic lands unknown, surrounded by the soothing lullabies of tropical waves and cooing gulls, a place of graceful practices and deep tradition, where the people come together in faith to drive away their common tragedy, to heal and live another day. A world steeped within a desperate perpetual cycle, not knowing when or even if they'd ever be free from the continual, lingering dread that faced them each and every single morning they opened their eyes. A chain of constant chaos, a pattern of annihilation and fear, a growing circle of sorrow burying their only hope. Also, there's this really dope game of underwater football that everybody in the world plays together in a floating sphere of liquid, suspended in a stadium that seats thousands of people in a city that's literally floating on the ocean. This game's totally rad and probably saved my life, so I'm going to talk about it. Like, a lot. My name's Matthias, and this video's called Final Fantasy X, Peace, Love, and the Spiral of Death. So, before we deep dive into the story, themes, and messages of this game, we probably ought to go over the mentality of the people who made the game during its development, and how this is the 10th entry in a video game franchise named Final Fantasy. So, to start, the original Final Fantasy X was produced by the Japanese video game developer known as Squaresoft, though nowadays they're known as Square Enix thanks to a merger with the Enix Corporation that occurred in 2003. Square was founded in 1983 by a man named Masafumi Miyamoto, the son of an electric power company CEO who used his father's resources to launch a startup from within the business. Miyamoto had no intention of taking on the family business, and instead set his sights on creative outlets, mainly in the rising video game industry in Japan during the 80s. He named the company Square in reference both to the term used in golf when a player is a stroke over par, and also for the company's goal to face their challenges head on. Square grew rather quickly as Miyamoto's ambitions soared. Shortly after establishing the company, he took on prospective talent from local businesses and universities, including Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hisashi Suzuki, who would rise to prominence over the course of the next few decades. After finally becoming sufficiently staffed, Square attempted to create their first video game, an adaptation of a television show named Touren Ingen. They found out really quickly that without the proper documentation regarding licenses and copyright, that the producers of said content could be really stingy, and had their first project shut down before it even got off the ground. Instead, in 1984, Square was able to create their own original game called The Death Trap, released on the NEC PC 8801, and was the first to be published under the company name. The Death Trap is a text-adventure game set in an African city-state that has been ravaged by war. Much of the game was praised for its creativity and descriptive action, and a sequel would be released the following year to similar acclaim. It wasn't until later in 1985 when Square reached a licensing agreement with Nintendo to create titles for the Famicom and NES, where they really took off as a game developer. Over the next 2 years, the company worked to create larger products, moving away from licensed properties and eventually moving into their own IPs, such as King's Knight in 1986. After moving into larger offices in Ginza, an upscale shopping district in Chuo, Tokyo, Square began to struggle after repeated commercial failures working on projects for the Famicom's disk system. Hironobu Sakaguchi would then pitch a role-playing game, or RPG, after witnessing the success of their rival company Enix's Dragon Quest. Miyamoto reluctantly gave the green light, and production began on the company's biggest coin flip yet. The first Final Fantasy game was conceptualized by a staff of only 5 people, that being Hironobu Sakaguchi, Nasir Jabeli, Akitoshi Kawazu, Koichi Ishii, and Nobuo Uematsu. After creating the base of the game, but getting stuck in its debugging stages, Miyamoto began to loosen the leash on its development staff and lent help from other teams at Square. The game got its name from Sakaguchi's desire to abbreviate whatever name they chose as FF, being so that in Japanese, they would only have to speak 4 syllables in recognition of the game. Uematsu would also later explain that it was a secret reference to Sakaguchi's personal life, where he swore in a conversation one day that if Final Fantasy had failed, he'd have left video game development altogether and returned to university. It's also speculated that because of Square's rough financial status during its development, had Final Fantasy failed to earn a substantial profit, it would have bankrupted the company, and they'd have been forced to shut down completely. Multiple theories and speculations were confirmed and denied by the staff, but in his most recent statement, Sakaguchi would go on to say, quote, "It was definitely a back-to-the-wall type situation back then, but any word that had started with an F would have been fine." So at this point, really only those original 5 had any idea what they were talking about back then. This is all to say that Final Fantasy became immensely successful, being published first in Japan in 1987 for the Famicom, and selling over 520,000 copies. After slow growth at the company and the desire to reach other territories abroad, the game was translated to English and ported to the United States for the NES in 1990, where the game exploded and sold over 700,000 copies over there as well. Critics praised its player character class system and engaging fantasy world. Over the years, several ports and compilations would bundle this game together with increased additions and patches, where it's now estimated to have sold up to 2 million copies worldwide. With its spike in popularity, a sequel was immediately greenlit, and Final Fantasy II would go on to release in 1988, which garnered even more attention. The series soon spiraled into global acclaim, and Final Fantasy is often now heralded as one of the most influential video games ever to have been created. While other games like the first Dragon Quest, known in the US as Dragon Warrior, were created previously and introduced the JRPG genre into the world, it's often cited that Final Fantasy and the staff that created it truly popularized it and showed the world what their vision had to offer. Final Fantasy became a regular first-party franchise for Square, and a new title would release almost yearly in Japan right up until 1992, when Final Fantasy VI released on the Super Nintendo and direction again shifted for the entire franchise. With the introduction of the N64, Sega Saturn, and Sony PlayStation, 3D game design spiked in popularity and forced Square to join the bandwagon. They took particular interest in the PlayStation, as Sony's newest console utilized more affordable hardware and manufacturing costs. The companies came to a production agreement, and Square began work on its newest entry in the franchise. During the development of several games under Square's banner in this era, a wealth of notable artistic and development talent would join the company and further steep themselves as pioneers of the Japanese video game industry. Yoshinori Kitase was hired on as a lead writer, Tetsuya Nomura and Kaori Tanaka as graphic and character artists. Kenichi Nishi would branch out to work on Chrono Trigger with Yuji Horii and Akira Toriyama. Kenji Ito and Yoko Shimomura would also be hired on around this time, as well as musical staff for various projects, such as the Mana series and Chrono Trigger games. Eventually, in 1997, Final Fantasy VII would be released worldwide, with an absolutely astounding budget put up for Sony's marketing to help push the games in international markets. The game was a smash hit, especially in PAL territories, which hadn't even been able to fully embrace the JRPG genre entirely up to this point. Final Fantasy VII reached 2 million copies sold in Japan alone within 3 days of release, prompting North American retailers to launch their sales earlier than anticipated to keep up with the popularity in their stores. Once again, Square had managed to shatter records and reaffirm themselves as iconic, skillful, and respectable video game developers, creating what is widely known to be one of, if not the most influential video game ever made. Though over the course of the next 5 years, Square found themselves again in hot water, struggling to keep themselves afloat in an ever-changing, ever-growing digital media industry. Following the success of Final Fantasy VII, Sakaguchi expressed interest in production of films and TV series in addition to their video game development studios. His intention was to create a multimedia franchise out of select Square brands in order to reach new audiences with their properties. In May of 1997, a new office was opened in Honolulu, Hawaii, and Square Pictures was born. The studio's purpose was to supply other company projects with high-quality animation and groundbreaking CGI, saving time for the other teams and keeping up with technological advancements on the horizon for the new century. Production began on a feature-length animated film titled Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, and the studio set immense goals for themselves. It would be the first photorealistic computer-animated movie for theatrical release, using some of the most advanced programming and most powerful technology available at the time. The studio's staff topped over 200 people, generating over 140,000 frames and being processed on 960 computers, all dedicated to rendering the final product. The amount of effort put forth to create this thing was staggering, and was recognized both then and now as a landmark in CGI animation. However, all of the incredible resources being poured into this production began to take their toll. The development exceeded its budget, shooting from $70 million to $137 million. Production stalled several times and took a lengthy 4 years to finish. The final box office revenue count landed at only $85 million, bombing their financial expectations fantastically. Because of the rampant spending and mismanaged efforts being poured into The Spirits Within, Square Pictures was liquidated and the staff was either let go or reassigned. The next title on the video game docket, Final Fantasy X, was pushed back repeatedly. It missed its original release window, and several roles on the development team had to be split among different people, as they were contributing work not only towards the movie, but also wrapping production on Final Fantasy IX and beginning work on 11 and pre-production on 12. With their resources spread so thin and money practically flushing itself down the toilet, Square had accidentally set themselves up for a disaster. When the second and third quarters of 2001 rolled around and there was still no monetary gain to recoup the losses from The Spirits Within, Square suffered a major financial blunder, causing their stock value to plummet and their financial backers to withdraw. Several new productions were halted, and all sorts of upper management were shuffled around or just straight up resigned in an effort to help stabilize the company. Square underwent massive corporate restructuring in an attempt to increase profits, mainly by trimming down developer staff and streamlining game production through them. They even came back to the negotiating table with Nintendo, looking to produce titles for consoles outside of their agreement with Sony. The next 2 years would be a massive wave of flux for the entire staff, forcing them to work uncomfortably and uncertainly on these projects in an attempt to save the company. Final Fantasy X would be the last project that all major staff of Square since its inception would work on together. This game is unlike a lot of the others in the franchise. It's got a tropical aesthetic, and the palette is much brighter and colorful. Characters are adorned with very loose-fitting and exposed clothing. The gameplay itself is slower paced and strategic. Yet, despite all of that, it's still very thematic and similar to the other worlds of Final Fantasy. People still rely on swords and magic to engage in battle, unimaginable creatures lurk around every corner, a deep and rich lore contextualizes the decisions people make on the way that they live, and inexplicable dramatic events still drive the peoples of this world. But the themes and very nature of this world read much deeper than the others, at least in my opinion. To me, the events of this game force characters to make very harsh decisions and contemplate things that people living their regular lives just shouldn't have to. Many Final Fantasy games, and other RPGs in general, begin their stories in the middle of a conflict of some kind. One or more major countries are at war, or a political struggle is occurring within a nation. These struggles have a clear beginning, and the possibility of ending them is at least within sight. But Final Fantasy X, as a game, is built upon uncertainty. There is a clear motif here of tradition or destiny. Spira is under the heel of an eternal monstrosity, doomed to a future of constant violence and regret. People here have been forced to accept that they will have to always live guarded, uncertain lives. A world where their peace is never permanent, their love is never enough, and all that they will ever know is a spiral of death. For the peoples of Spira, peace is in short supply. Their world is stuck in a cycle of chaos and doom, and as such, their lives are lived as sparingly as possible. Nobody invests in long-term plans for their futures, playing children are rarely seen, and settlements are spread far and barely grow larger than a village in most locations. Everything has to take into account the massive destructive force that looms ever closer on the horizon, rising suddenly to annihilate everything at a moment's notice. Suddenly, all of these additional steps have to be taken in order for people to live their lives. Think about all of the couples trying to start families. Would there be a safe enough place to settle down and maybe find a home? Would you be able to keep your own children safe? Is it even responsible to bring children into this world plagued by a returning monstrosity? All of these questions and more strain the already complicated nature of starting a family, and yet the peoples of Spira continue to contemplate these decisions. The same mindset occurs when their leisure time is considered in this world too. The people here live in constant fear, and yet they have to find ways to spend their time when they aren't working. And everybody from all nations finds the fun in the same sport, to the point where a massive international tournament is played in the only large residential city as well. Peace means different things to different people. Everyone is at different places emotionally and developmentally in their lives, and where some people might draw the line may be in a totally different place than someone else's. That peace can be the deciding factor in how a person chooses to approach the world. Someone with a lack of peace will be fundamentally more downtrodden and standoffish, and that will reflect in the way that they interact with other people. Their existence has evolved into one of pain, and their suffering bleeds into other people's lives. Alternatively, somebody who has discovered their own peace will be able to find the positivity in most other situations, or at the very least, cope in effective ways. A shining star attempting to guide others through the tragedy forced upon the others. That peace will radiate to those around them, and it becomes easy to look up to that person who carries themselves with such resolve. The denizens of Spira are forced to struggle for their lives, debating with themselves what exactly it is that will bring them peace. Is it for their hometown team to win a blitzball game? For their daughter to get married to somebody responsible? To find purpose among the clerics at the temple? Or is it to find the destruction of the indomitable sin? All of the peoples here live fragile lives, contained by fear and never knowing if they'll even live to see the next day. Yet somehow they have to be content with that. They have to figure the condition they'll get to live, and it's terrifying. The trouble comes down to whether or not a person in this environment can truly find some form of peace to align with, whether it's their own, or a cause driving the others around them. In the case of those from Spira, a literal world of constant conflict, people will go on entire global pilgrimages to discover a form of peace for themselves. Several causes and organizations were derived out of a desire to destroy the uncertainty that plagues their world. A band of warriors, who ironically call themselves the Crusaders, intend to defeat sin without the use of the temple's practices, and challenges the beast regularly, never dissuaded by their failures. Their international campaign takes them all over, and accepting assistance from every corner of the world. Even a race of machinist inventors, the Albed, who are seen as heretic troublemakers by most in Spira, often put themselves in front of others in order to protect the innocents just trying to live their lives. Despite taking advantage of the machines and robotics to handle their dirty work, which is seen as taboo in the eyes of the dominant religion around the world, they continue to fight for others in an effort to establish peace on their planet. Not because somebody told them to, or because it is thought to be the only way, but because to the Crusaders and the Albed, it's the only way that they can fight back. The only way for them to gain control of something in this world possessed by the uncontrollable. So then, who should one fight for? And do you have to fight it all to manifest peace? History has taught us that the moment conflict arises, the scenario becomes a powder keg ready to explode in bloody violence. Politics surrounding war are volatile and intricate, yet we always seem to find ourselves knocking on that door more often than not. People will come up with any excuse to start a fight, especially when it comes to the lives of others hanging in the balance. But the truth will get out at some point, eventually. Are you fighting for the people to guarantee a tomorrow for them and help them feel like they don't have to look over their shoulder every night before they go to bed? Or do you enjoy the hunt? Do you fight because you like to and you have your own reasons for getting into the thick of it? There is a difference between fighting for yourself and fighting for the sake of others. Fighting because you feel like you have something to prove, and fighting so that others don't have to. Both roads will force you to linger on a path of strife, constantly in conflict and potentially never finding a resolution. You can have all of the motivation in the world to grow stronger and overcome every obstacle in your path, and finally stick it to the ones who did you the worst, and still come up empty. All of your potential and strength of heart, and yet when the mission is done, it blows away in the wind. Choosing to fight for the people is noble, and yet it can mean nothing if their true intentions don't ally with the way the people wish to be treated. Fighting in the name of the people and fighting for the betterment of the people are separate ideals. Knowing where your own ambitions end and where that of the people's begin is key to finding the medium piece between the lines. And then you have to ask yourself, how far are you willing to go? Is this cause truly worth fighting for? Can you dedicate your life for your cause, for your vision of peace? A lack of conviction can sometimes be more dangerous than those testing them. Whatever your purpose, it's important to believe in it with all of your heart. Others will see that spark within you and may even start to believe in it for themselves. It's one of the most inspiring things in the world to see someone who has found harmony within themselves and then sharing it with the rest of the world. That strength, however, is not to be underestimated. Whatever conviction a person may have, it's important that they not lose sight of themselves or their humanity while in pursuit of it. Power changes a person. You suddenly find yourselves in different situations with new choices to make and life-changing consequences because of those decisions. It all revolves around how far you're willing to push yourself for the sake of your own ideals, about what kind of person you're willing to see yourself become to accomplish your goals. Your journey will change you. Whether it's for the better or worse is entirely up to your discretion. There will be villains, naysayers, and detractors of all sorts as you figure out what it is you're fighting for. There will always be people there to say exactly what you don't want to hear, and it will be your strength of heart to overcome it all. The power to rise above the noise, or the power to slay it where it stands, soaking the ground in even more disheartening venom. A proud warrior will stand tall to proclaim and herald their ideas, but are just as likely to slash through their opposition as they are to debase it. Strength of heart doesn't necessarily equate to a decent morality, but it can be a major deciding factor in how they choose to approach accomplishing their goals. When your cause, your idea of peace, is threatened or is believed to be past only a single barrier, then suddenly the idea of ending even a single life seems not so bad. You have to judge the value of that single person's life against your ambitions and what they mean against them, and whether or not your ideals, your peace, is greater than theirs. And at the end of that conflict, the final judgment occurs. The stronger will prevails. In this world of constant death and carnage, Spira is often seen as a place of sacrifices, where death is necessary as a way to achieve peace. The temples encourage their summoners to endure, to journey and experience everything from all corners of the world, only to end their lives and damn somebody else's in order to save their world. But is a moment of reprieve, temporary peace, worth that admission? What about the inverse of that? What happens when a rogue from the temple decides there's only one way to find true peace for the denizens of the world, and that is simply to die? With a will as solid as any other, he's decided the apocalypse is inevitable. This monstrosity will just consume everything, so there is no point in fighting it. His answer, his will, is to end the lives of every person to spare them a life of sorrow. And no matter which way you look at it, this too is a rendition of peace, and is just as valid as any other. It simply remains buried in immeasurable tragedy and unparalleled sacrifice. Final Fantasy X is also known amongst the fanbase to have one of the most compelling romance plots across the entire franchise. Athletic hotshot meets quiet religious girl. What's not to like? Titus and Yuna have magnetic chemistry due to their similarities, ambitions, and heart. Despite their totally opposite public behaviors, it's their inner strength that draws them to each other and provides those around them with the will to carry on. Their love for one another turns into compassion when dealing with the strife that plagues the rest of the world, and they fight for the people as much as they do for each other. They bring the best out of one another in so many ways. Titus learns to consider other people and the words that he says the more time he spends around the studious summoner. And in turn, Yuna is brought out of her shell and learns to speak for herself and stand her ground after observing the headstrong sports pro. This grim, unforgiving world is made brighter the longer these two walk through it, and their personalities bringing the best out of each other the longer they continue together. In this way, their love turns to compassion that is spread outward, and is eventually the reason why they can turn things around for Spira in the end. It becomes a focal point about halfway through their journey, what an expression of love can do for not only those in love, but for those observing it as well. Despite the bonds that exist and grows between Titus and Yuna, they're forced to ask themselves if what they feel is right, or if there's a way they could benefit those around them instead of their selfish reasons. This romance side plot is used in juxtaposition to the constant hatred and violence that ravages the world, but it's also used to exemplify older, traditional examples of marriage and the concept of love. There is only one large governmental organization in Spira, a theocracy run by a council of elder priests, pushing the teachings of a religion called Yevon upon the people. The Church of Yevon has its hands in many of the functions put in place for Spira, and are no strangers to creating fronts for hidden purposes that make them look favorable in the eyes of the public. Many times, a public figure or faction will be manipulated or encouraged by the clergy to commit certain acts or participate in questionable activities, especially if it leads to some kind of profit for the church. We're shown this directly when Yuna is invited to one of the church's maester's home, that of Seymour Guado, and is given a marriage proposal. Yuna is one of the more prolific summoners of the world, being the daughter of a summoner who had previously succeeded in defeating Sin. Seymour himself is an icon, as he is of mixed race and acts as a bridge between the studies of Yevon and the traditions of his home. While there is some form of tension, I guess, between them, a romantic relationship barely exists between the two. Yet this proposal asks a toll of Yuna, manipulating her true feelings and exacerbating her conscience. Throughout their journey, Yuna and her guardians are constantly surrounded by grief, encountering families who have lost loved ones, squads of crusaders chasing sin, and even other summoners traveling on their own pilgrimages. With each new relationship founded across this journey, the party is forced to grow, confronting their preconceptions and their lack of knowledge. Titus is thrown into this apocalyptic version of his world with barely a scrap of knowledge about anything outside his home city and favorite sport. But after spending time on the journey with Yuna, and learning about how a community is really supposed to feel, he warms up to their traditions and behaviors, and is fully prepared to call this new world his home when he recognizes that he might not be able to return to his. Raqqa begins his second journey as a guardian with a new summoner, however with new grudges and prejudice because of his previous failure. It isn't until he's spent time around an enthusiastic upstart, a young woman named Raqqa, from the Albed race that Raqqa is now violently antagonistic towards, that his shell begins to soften and is eventually able to embrace her culture and family like his own. Even somebody as hardened as Orin, who is a surviving guardian from a previous pilgrimage accompanying Yuna's father, undergoes a period of emotional rehabilitation. He is forced to confront his losses from his first journey and accept kindness and trust from a new ensemble who have nothing but respect and admiration for him. Yuna herself is perhaps the biggest conduit for spreading love and compassion for others in this game. Her father, High Summoner Braska, is a global icon for being able to defeat sin in the past, and has thus made her near celebrity status. Suddenly, massive expectations were set up around her by the priests of the church and the citizens of Spira without her so much as blinking. Yuna was destined for great things, to be a successful summoner like her father, and vanquish sin, bringing peace for those all over. The world was painted in black and white for Yuna. The people needed a hero, someone to save them from their sorrow, and she had the talent for it, and she had the will, so she instilled in herself that she would fight for a better tomorrow. So with every person she met on her journey, Yuna reassured them of her goal. She strove to find the bright side in whatever situation, to lead those lost in the dark to a new light. As a strong woman, and as a courageous summoner, she opened her heart to the woes of the people. She told them to trust in her, to place their hopes in Yevon and its teachings. When it's discovered that the foundations of her faith were corrupt, relying on ancient traditions covered in paradoxical logic and tragic sacrifice, suddenly her compassion that she spread her entire journey means nothing. The love that she had given to others as they suffered and grieved throughout her home and beyond was hollow, and she had nothing to replace it with. Yuna spent her whole life believing in the Church of Yevon and what it represented, but she was unwittingly playing into their falsehoods. Her identity as a summoner and a practitioner of the faith was called into question. The endgame of the Yevon religion is pretty open-ended throughout the conclusion to Final Fantasy X. We don't actually get to meet the true evil behind the journey. All we encounter is this wicked phantom of the most powerful summoner ever to exist. We don't know of his intentions or what he may have hoped to preserve during his youth, and all that's left behind in his place is a council of elder maesters who interprets his will based on the situation he left behind after his summoning of the faith. The council veils their disparaging acts with commandments of harmony, pushing the citizens and their clergy to repent for the sins of those long past in order to one day, hopefully, eventually, banish sin. The foundations of Yevon aren't inherently evil. The religion was truly founded in a want to respect and remember past mistakes. Sin was manifested when the world was at war, and is a symbol of mankind's rush to hatred and violence when encountering opposition. Their goal was to create an unstoppable force of endearment and devotion to abolish the wickedness that sin stood for. But in the end, they gave into the temptations of the power their organization accrued. The religion became a weapon instead of a shield. The council claims that their aim is to keep the people of Spira happy by secretly manipulating them and harnessing the power of faith to hide the perpetuity of their apocalypse. Grand Maester Micah has lived far beyond his years, and yet he is still at the helm, not trusting another soul to take his place. He sees no other way than for summoners to sacrifice themselves to keep the cycle going, and all who oppose him are heretics and must be neutralized. The newly ordained Maester Seymour follows suit, gaining more and more power only by killing and manipulating others. He believes that death is the only way, and by killing as many people as he can, he would be showing mercy and compassion to the people of Spira. At the end of the road, a decision is forced upon the party. Yuna, who has visited and bonded with each temple's faith, must now choose a member of her own guardians to die and achieve the final Aeon, the only being strong enough to defeat sin. By this point in her journey, Yuna has been tricked, betrayed, and had her emotions destroyed. But the constant in her pilgrimage has been her friends' unwavering support. They each have grown and placed their own faith in Yuna, as they recognize that her will is strong enough to defeat sin. So many of them volunteer. They believe in Yuna that much, that they are willing to give up their wills and their lives to make sure that she succeeds. Her adoptive brother and sister, who have resolved to be there for her like they couldn't their previous wards. Her childhood guardian, who has journeyed with her and protected her since she was just a small kid. Her newly introduced romantic, giving her new hope and drawing her from her reluctant shell. But she just can't go through with it. Yuna decides to find another way. And not because she doesn't believe they wouldn't go through with it, they love her, as she loves each of them. But if they go through with this, and someone sacrifices themselves for the sake of the pilgrimage, only for sin to eventually come back later, can she truly believe with all of her heart that it all meant anything? She would be forced to give up the life of someone she cares about deeply and her own. But if the monstrosity is destined to simply reappear, does that mean their effort getting here was in vain? Are her bonds with her loved ones that have been forged, broken, and reignited since starting this journey actually worth throwing away for little more than a short-lived false hope? The name Spira is derived from the word spiral, like the shape. A winding, twisting curve with neither a start point or an end point. It is a peculiar, never-ending pattern meant to represent a constant cycle that, while perpetual, still shows progression in either direction. The events on the pattern repeat, but continue forward using new variables. The process will carry on, and those taking part will be able to look back on how far they've come, only to see that nothing has really changed much at all. For the denizens of this world, living in the oasis of carnage and uncertainty, their spiral has been twisting for nearly a millennium. Since the war was abruptly ended with the summoning of the faith, a devilish loop was established, bringing an end to things like hope and faith in the future. Instead, a new beginning to a terrifying cycle had made itself known. No longer could the people sit idly by, taking their time and peace for granted. Terrible monsters sequestered the common folk into fringe villages of only a dozen or so people. Gathering in large numbers, were quickly and violently quashed by the indomitable sin, punishing the world for their supposed vanity. The only elderly folk around were those who saw themselves in the same place, never straying too far from home and leaving at the instant their town became overoccupied. And the only way for a summoner to defeat the abomination and bring a temporary era of peace was to sacrifice themselves in the final battle. Even the leaders of this world are already dead, but walking among the living. This world, filled with constant uncertainty and fear, was caught in a spiral of death. Part of the message this game tries to convey is that despite being caught in a cycle, there are ways in which even a single person can make a difference and break out of that pattern of hopelessness. It's part of the reason Titus is so damn cheerful all the time. Seriously, this guy is optimistic to a ridiculous degree, but then maybe that was the point the entire time. This world is incredibly glum, to the point where only a select few of the main cast have obnoxiously loud voice acting. Titus, Raqqa, and Riku, who are all outgoing and adventurous types, are often the soul of the party, making bold proclamations and getting to the front lines to take on their opposition. But despite all of this bravado, none would be able to function properly without the heart that the others provide. Auron, Lulu, Kimahri, and most especially Yuna carry ideals and strength of will that acts like a glue keeping the party together. They're all definitely soft-spoken, frequently not butting heads or interjecting unless they are pushed to do so, but their will is powerful. Let the others do the talking, but when it comes time to look inward for resolve, these guys will keep themselves together and help the rest find theirs. Only when the two sides of the same coin work together will real change begin to shift weight. Yuna is chastised for having such a large party of guardians during her journey on multiple occasions, but she is very quick to point out that it suits her comfortably and wouldn't have it any other way. This cold and unforgiving world has hardened many warriors to believe that they can only trust in themselves, because relying on others, or getting your power from others, can be quickly taken away here. With something as monstrous as the mighty sin roaming the world as freely as it does, it's difficult to ignore that point of view. But Yuna and company spit in the face of such odds. Instead of believing that the journey they're on is too harsh for a meager few to go it alone, each of them has had something taken away from them in this world because of the constant cycle of death. Each of them has every right to hate this world and play the villain. I think very few would blame any of these people if they chose a life of violence and wickedness with how they've been wronged, but they simply choose not to do that. And not because they're just good people, but because they wish to grow, to be better. Some have promises to keep, some have desires to fulfill, some just want to prove themselves. None of their journeys are taken alone. They push forward through the spiral in an effort to be stronger than it, and they do it by keeping their relationships close to their hearts as they move forward, never knowing when it will truly, finally end. And it's a scary thing to try and trust people that deeply. It must be absolutely horrifying to know that in this world of cruelty, unpredictability, and deceit, you need to put your entire heart on the line in order to succeed. Despite the center of this story revolving around a religion that promotes unity and total faith in a single body, the people are simply reluctant to do so. If they can't give their will to Yevon to solve their problems, then there's no way they're giving it to anyone else. It's another of this game's messages that you shouldn't be afraid to give your heart to other people. Life is simply too short for that hesitancy. One moment you're staring across the campfire at the person who makes your heart beat a little bit faster than it's ever done. The next, you're watching that person cling to the side of a boat as they get swallowed up by the heartless sea. So, where were you when you realized that you loved them? That you wanted to give them your heart, and hope to hell that they wanted to return the gesture? People weren't made to tear each other down. We all want companionship in some form or another. Life is sweeter that way. Even when you're in the mundane, living your simple lives, trying to just be happy, wouldn't you enjoy sharing that with someone else? When you're facing the biggest, seemingly insurmountable task that you've ever been charged with, wouldn't it give you more confidence knowing that there was somebody in your corner with unwavering support? You can't let yourself suffer in the fear of loneliness. You can't sit on the sidelines and hope that it'll all work out eventually. You can't be afraid to lose everything when you need it the most. Final Fantasy X goes to great lengths to show the player the difference in the power that is utilized by each opposing factor to the party during Yuna's pilgrimage. Your force is multiplied by the power of love and integrity that only grows the longer they travel together. It shows just how willing they are to put their lives on the line for each other, and when the chips are down, nothing is too large or too strong to bring them down. Overwhelming ambition may slow them at times, but opposition is the key factor to growth, and through their quest, the party tries incredibly hard to prove that there is always another way. Yevon provides the blueprint for the mission, but this mission demands sacrifice. The church remains to be this enormous roadblock, forcing the people to give up and drop their intentions right then and there. They declare that sacrifice is necessary for the world to continue towards peace, otherwise the slaughter will go on unchecked. No matter what, people die, never getting the chance to see the end of their people's strife. The world remains polluted with dreams cut short, regrets left unmourned, and violence to lament. Even those who would attempt another way, such as one of Yevon's own maesters, still believe that to save the people, they must die. Seymour possesses an overwhelming amount of power for himself and all of the will to chase his dream, yet he still comes to the same conclusion. He's become deluded, suffering from his own curve in the spiral, contributing to it without seeing a proper end. He will continue this spiral, it's just simply down another path. The trajectory is different, but the cycle remains the same. There is always another way. If the solution isn't obvious, then you'll have to just figure it out for yourself. A cycle of tragedy is no way to live. You must stand your ground, fight your sorrow, and be strong. The conclusion that the party comes to goes to defy everything that Yevon and its spiral of death ever stood for. It is not the will of some prophetical summoner that dictates how the people of Spira should live, it's the peoples themselves. Each person has that strength to carry on within them, and sometimes that strength just needs a little help to be pulled out. But it's there. waiting to burn as bright as the sun. It's easy to stand on a pedestal and scream and cry about how the world has fallen apart. It is easy to disparage others from bettering themselves and to tear them down. When the most vile come into power, it's easy for them to stay in power by belittling the hopes and dreams of the optimistic. The corruption and the anguish that perpetuate from such a sorry lapse in their own humanity. But you have to be strong. It's not easy, but it is okay to hope for a better tomorrow. The odds can be completely stacked against you, but you will never truly be alone. Somebody, somewhere, is always in your corner. That's why we journey. That's why we fight. The chains that bind us to our desperation and shackles made of our insecurities were made to be broken. We forge bonds with others, and we find something that's real to believe in, and we push forward. Our struggles may take shape in the length of a spiral, but that shape can eventually change. All you have to do is look at it in a different way. When Final Fantasy X finally landed on store shelves in 2001, it blew Square's expectations out of the water within just the first day. Over 2 million units were shipped out to stores in Japan, 1.5 million copies were sold nationwide. This caused the printing of additional copies to move up immediately, and Square made over 17 billion yen in sales the first week alone. The game significantly exceeded the sales performances of Final Fantasies 7 and 9 within the same time frame, and would go on to become the first PlayStation 2 game to reach 2 million and later 4 million copies sold. The game received Best Game at the Japan Game Awards for 2001 to 2002, and in America it became 7th in GameSpot's top 10 games of the year. As time went on, people still couldn't quite let this game go either. In 2006, Famitsu magazine subscribers voted Final Fantasy X to be the best game of all time, and came in 6th for IGN's top 10 best looking PS2 games of all time. In 2008, readers of Dengeki magazine voted the game as the most tear-inducing video game of all time. This game remains massively successful and popular to date, with many players and culture enthusiasts praising the gameplay, storytelling, and symbology that was brought to life through Square's efforts. Thanks to the critical and financial success of Final Fantasy X, Square was able to get back on its feet and commit to company-changing policies and decisions that continue to affect their development and business practices. Square returned to talks with other multimedia companies in an effort to expand into new territories without having to divide their efforts and talent into other teams among the same banner. They struck a deal with Enix Corporation, a publisher who marketed manga, strategy guides, and licensed merchandise, and in April of 2003, the companies successfully merged into Square Enix, with Enix being the surviving corporate entity. With their additional resources, more projects began to line up for the developer's slate, including hands in the Dragon Quest franchise, and the groundwork for another CGI film was laid to begin development, a sequel story to Final Fantasy VII titled Advent Children. Since then, Square Enix has kept its head held high, acquiring other smaller studios and maintaining their name as the most talented JRPG developer in the business. 2014 was a year of constant highs and lows, and although the year was pretty dangerous around the world, there was still a fair bit to celebrate too, you know? in America, courts in Alaska, Arizona, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Montana, Nevada, North and South Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Wyoming all abolished gay marriage bans that year, making it completely legal in 35 out of the 50 states. After the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change displayed its findings, almost 200 countries signed a bill committing to reducing the use of fossil fuels in an attempt to fight global climate change. The Indian Space Research Organization successfully reached Martian orbit with a space probe, becoming the first Asian country to reach Mars with satellite technology ever. From 135,908 feet above Roswell, New Mexico, Alan Eustace set a world record for the highest and longest freefall jump, launching from a helium-filled balloon, breaking the sound barrier, and his flight lasting 4 minutes and 27 seconds, almost 26 miles down. And in December, the US government actually made diplomatic headway with Cuba for the first time since the 80s, effectively putting a capstone on the Cold War. 2014 was also the year that Guardians of the Galaxy, Captain America the Winter Soldier, The Hunger Games, Mockingjay Part 1, The Fault in Our Stars, The Wolf of Wall Street, and the inescapable Disney's Frozen came to movie theaters everywhere. And in contrast to how I feel about people comparing tragedies to one another's lives, I feel the opposite way about celebrating success stories. Like, you want to be able to talk about the things that actually went right for you in your life. The important thing about comparing yourself to others is that you need to highlight the things that you got right as well. Everyone is at different places in their lives, and that's nothing to really be ashamed of. Take your victories as they come, and don't try to mask your accomplishments. In 2014, I suffered the loss of family that was very close to me, who I cared for and was very much attached to. But you know what? In 2014, I graduated high school with the rest of my class. I still remember each and every one of their names and faces, and who all was friends with who, and where we wanted to be when we grew up. I met the woman that would go on to be the mother of my 2 beautiful little girls. I purchased my first ever vehicle from somebody, a little red Hyundai Accent, and adorned it with the logo of my favorite superhero. And that cancer that my father was diagnosed with that year, well, he just retired this year in 2024 from medical simulation technology and is happily enjoying not having to get up with an alarm clock every morning for the first time since high school. Life goes on, and it's an amazing thing when you realize that it's happening. The struggle was there, and it was real, and it kicked your ass. But you're on the other side of that now, and it was your love that got you through it. Your peace was attained. You broke free from the spiral. Final Fantasy X is a game that meant a lot to me growing up as a kid. There were a lot of video games that I started playing when I was probably way too young to even try, but Final Fantasy X was probably one of the most important ones to come along at just the right time. I first played the game way back in 2002 when we got it for the PlayStation 2, but I actually didn't get to finish it until 2013, when I was a junior in high school and the HD remaster had come out. I was always stuck at the craziest parts of the game, like when a chapter was ending and the story was turning a corner. You know, like the Sinspawn Gui fight, or the Macalania Temple Anima battle, or the Evray airship fight, or the goddamn Seymour Flux battle on Mount Gakazet, or the Unalesca revelation. Maybe it was because of all of those failed attempts, forcing me to watch the same cutscenes scenes over and over again, but the emotion that's pulled out of each character captivated me. The way they passionately argue about finding another way, about overcoming the odds so heavily stacked against them. There were so many times where the forces of a 1,000-year-old organization nearly defeated them physically and emotionally. Titus and his friends had more than enough opportunities to give up and simply let the current carry them away into fates predestined for failure and ruin. They saw what the cycle looked like from the outside and the inside, and they made a choice. They chose to break that cycle, to give them a fair shake and try their hardest to change the destiny of an apocalypse. They brought freedom and clarity to the people of Spira. They persevered, and it gave them all a new tomorrow. This group of warriors from all walks of life came together, gave it everything they had left, and were able to stand proud after all of their loss and agony. They brought themselves peace. That's gonna do it for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate each and every single one of you. As always, if you liked what you saw today, don't forget to give this video a big ol' thumbs up, and let me know what your favorite Final Fantasy game is in the comments below. Don't forget to be awesome, be kind and rewind, and have a wonderful night. Excelsior.
Thank you.